As promised, here is my analysis on the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for Elden Ring. Of these 41 bosses, 10 of these are Remembrance bosses, which are Divine Beast Dancing Lion, Rellana Twin Moon Knight, Commander Gaius, Mesmer the Impaler, Metir I Hardly Know It, Ramina Taint of the Butt, Putrescent Knight, Midra Lord of the Frenzied Flame, Shadowtree Avatar, and Promised Sub Radahn. But frankly, even though Bale the Dread doesn't give you a remembrance, it gives the Heart of Bale, which can be traded for 2 separate spells, so I don't think anyone will get mad at me for including Bale the Dread in this list. Also, I didn't include the Leda Company fight, even though it is a super dang cool fight. It's more of a set-piece story moment rather than a traditional fight. Out of the other bosses, annoyingly you fight 7 separate dragon bosses, which are just reused from Elden Ring, along with 2 rune bears, a tree sentinel duo, a demi-human queen, a death right bird, and a falling star beast, all of which once again are reused. So this doesn't actually give us much of an interesting insight, as they were already covered in Elden Ring. If we go into the online perception first to give the general rankings of difficulty as I did before, we see that with no surprises the top ranked most difficult boss fights are Radahn, Service Switch of Miquella, Mesmer, Rellana, Bale, and Gaius. The lower down ranks of the main fights are the Golden Hippopotamus, the Black Jail Knight, the Shadowtree Avatar, and Ramina Taint of the Butt. A quick side note on how I recorded the data this time. Instead of watching 3 separate runs of people playing Elden Ring for the first time, this time I watched 5 playthroughs of Shadow of the Erdtree, which would be better in weeding out certain outliers, such as the Royal Rat Authority. I also recorded another 5 runs of Shadow of the Erdtree, where it was specifically focused on people who summoned to see the difference. It's important to note that I'm looking at the data here on purely fighting without any summons for below. Starting with the Golden Hippo, ranking 8th in the data, it is up 5 spots from the perception, with an average of 66 deaths and 627 hits over 3 runs. It sort of acts as a gate boss if you go into the Shadowkeep from the front, and the Golden Hippo is a decently powerful boss, consistently killing players. Even though it becomes a normal enemy later on, at the points that you fight it in the Shadowkeep, it is a decent challenge. Another note, this boss is the most difficult fight that isn't a Remembrance boss. There are 3 bosses I want to speak about in the Mausoleums, the Black Jail Knight, Rakshasa and Red Bear, typically fought in this order from what I observed. These are fights that you cannot summon at all to help, and you fight a player build boss. Black Jail Knight acts as both a immediate reference to Guts and also a clear tone setter for the DLC that you cannot walk through this with your level 250 builds, and you need to level your Shadowtree fragments. Black Jail Knight is spot on with its data and its perception rank, mustering 34 deaths and 283 hits, yet it is Rakshasa that is up 6 spots in the data from 19th to 13th, with the swinging of the long katana catching a lot of people out. And then you have Red Bear, which accumulated 0 deaths across all 5 runs. It seemed to be a victim of people just being stronger and wiser for this fight. Yet oddly, if you look at the data where people summoned predominantly, Red Bear gained 5 deaths. This could possibly be from the over-reliance upon another ally. The last Mausoleum fight with the Dancer of Anar got 0 deaths in any of the 10 runs. The top most difficult bosses are understandably the Remembrance bosses, but a special mention to Demi-Human Ons with 21 deaths and 154 hits in 17th for the data, along with the first Death Knight you encounter on Shadow Altus with 32 deaths and 210 hits, ranking 14th in the data. Quick moving fights with unpredictable attacks when you fight them first. Now let's move on to the juicy parts.
Nice.
The lowest ranking Remembrance boss is Metir, coming in 16th in the data, down 7 places, with 22 deaths and 289 hits. This boss certainly has a diverse arsenal of attacks, but it is a side quest fight where you essentially have to have explored the entire map to unlock them. You are likely to be quite highly levelled in Erdtree fragments. They also have quite a large hitbox and very low aggression, which I will get onto later. On another note, Midra and Bale weren't as difficult as the online perception, being down 3 and 7 spots respectively to 9th and 11th place in the data. Midra having 50 deaths and 595 hits, while Bale only managing 37 deaths and 410 hits over 3 runs. Midra makes sense in being quite susceptible to bleed and staggering, yet Bale just proved to be fairly easy to dodge, a large hitbox you could roll into, and in terms of attacks, very unaggressive. The Erdtree Avatar and Divine Beast Dancing Lion were up 5 and 4 places respectively in the data, with 90 deaths and 1,550 hits for the Erdtree Avatar, and 145 deaths and 1,729 hits for the Divine Beast. The Divine Beast makes sense for an increase in the ranking, probably being the first Remembrance boss you face in the DLC, so people usually follow the pattern of not associating the earlier bosses as the most difficult, considering you can face a version of it later as another optional boss. But it did prove to be a great opening challenge for players. The Erdtree Avatar is more interesting. 3 separate health bars coming back twice, has a wide range of quite unpredictable attacks, but I have a theory for why it's tough, and I'll get onto that later. For the remaining bosses, Romina matched its perception in 10th, Gaius matched their perception as the 5th toughest boss, however in 3rd place was actually Mesmer. A very tough fight, killing players 251 times and hitting them 2,633 times. R'Ehlana, however, is a very tough boss, coming in 2nd with 627 deaths and 9,161 hits, up 1 spot. The first true stumbling block for a lot of players, which seems to transcend the reputation of being easier if you're an early gateway boss, perhaps due to this being a unique enemy in a DLC. But you all saw this coming. In first place, promised consort Radahn, indeed topping Melania, while being topped by Miquella. They have 1,136 deaths over 3 runs and a monstrous 19,253 hits. Yes, everything you have heard is true. A wide range of attacks, maybe the most aggressive boss ever made, and just a nightmare for every build to deal with, even at max Erdtree fragments. I mean, I'm not very good, and I had to use the Mimic tier to fight Radahn at the end.
It's embarrassing. It's a disgrace.
But it's all well and good just saying that the data says that these bosses kill you the most. But there must be a tangible reason why, so I actually wanted to look into the aggression of the bosses. A diverse arsenal is great, but if they wander around the stage for a long time, allowing you to hit them, they're not exactly very difficult. So I wanted to look at the top 3 most difficult fights from each game and analyse them, along with Shadow of the Erdtree. First off, I started by just recording every attack combo. If an attack from Sir Elon had 2 sweeps of his katana in a move that would be repeated a lot, this would be 1 attack. But then I slowly realised once you get to the newer game bosses, these combos would last a long time, and so the data would look like they've barely attacked you many times. So, every single attacking motion must be recorded. The waterfowl dance, for instance, can be broken down into these different parts of the attack. The initial swing, which has 4 swings. There is a follow-up with 2 swings. Next, rising through the air for 4 separate swings in an arcing motion, and finishing with an AoE/blast to top it, which is 11 attacks individually. There may be some questions about a long projectile attack, such as the Bell Gargoyle's Breath, but that is 1 slow and predictable attack without any variance, so that's 1 attack. Yet Dark Eater Medea's Laser Breath, which has distinct movements back and forth, Areas of attacks and phases will count as multiple attacks. Indulge an old hollow like myself. So the aggression is going to be measured by what I like to call the aggression factor, which I calculated as the time in the boss fight divided by the amount of separate attacks a boss does. For example, we have the Flame Lurker, where a fight would take 2 minutes and 12 seconds, and in this time they would get off 32 separate player damaging moves. This would then give them 4.125 seconds per attack. Doing this a few times to give the Flame Lurker's average AF of 4.62. I've created a breakdown of the top 3 bosses in each game here, with Man-Eaters being by far the least aggressive with 6.8 AF, while Genichiro and Abyss Watchers are the most aggressive with 2.3 and 2.4 AF respectively. Ishin and Melania are also notable here with 2.6 and 2.7 AF respectively, but it's difficult to just break it down by boss since some aspects of the different forms affect the AF quite a lot. For example, Melania has the Aeonian Bomb at the start of the second form, which takes 14 seconds to attack and cool down. So this will drop the average quite a lot. So let's break it down on the individual form level. Nameless King is a big change here based on form. The King of the Storm part has an average of 8.1 seconds per attack, while the Nameless King form has 2.9 seconds per attack. Similarly, Radagon of the Golden Order has 3.7 AF, while the Elden Beast has 8.1 AF. Another thing I noticed while watching the Genichiro and Ishin fights are the Way of Tomoe and the final form of Ishin's Sword Saint are slightly less aggressive according to the data. But this actually comes from one specific reason. In both bosses, they fight using a lightning slash, which can be parried with the lightning reversal, which then inflicts decent posture damage on the boss and will shock them for about 5 seconds. Otherwise, these forms would be just as aggressive. Abyss Watchers here shines once again, which actually backs up my idea that they are one of the most aggressive bosses, with 1.9 seconds per attack when the second Abyss Watcher is revived. Just unrelenting pressure. Sometimes bosses can vary their aggression based on where you position yourself to them. For example, if you're quite far away from Melania, usually she just walks around slightly slower, whereas if you're in range, she flies about attacking you like a demon. Finally, it's quite nice looking at this on a game level, as each game refines the bosses more and more, and makes them more aggressive, in line with the range of tools the player has available. Sekiro being top makes sense, as parrying the bosses is far more important. Therefore, making the bosses attack you more naturally makes more sense design-wise. It's worth noting that if you remove the Elden Beast part of the fight, Elden Ring's average would be 3.2 AF, the most aggressive game. So, how does Shadow of the Erdtree fit in? I recorded the AF for each of the Shadow of the Erdtree Remembrance bosses, and the top 3 bosses, if you were to carry on for each game, would make Shadow of the Erdtree have a 2 AF. But if you took the average of all of the bosses, it would still be lower with 2.9 AF. Breaking down the Remembrance bosses individually, with the highest aggression factor of 4.3, meaning that every 4.3 seconds the boss will attack you, is Baal the Dread, which I mentioned earlier, which is also the main boss which has the largest drop from the online perception. It's not as aggressive as you think. The Divine Beast does have a large aggression factor of 3.7, yet comes 4th place in the data. It is one of the first Remembrance bosses. And so not having caught up in the new leveling system, combined with the fact that it is the first boss that you actually encounter, probably, will give it a perception of being easier than it actually is. The Shadow Tree avatar is a strange one. Ranked 5 places higher in the data, but has the second largest AF of 3.9. Even if you remove the third form, which shoots up to 5.1, mainly from doing the long blast attacks. It lowers it to 3.3 AF, which is still the third highest. Researching the Shadow Tree avatar a bit closer, it is resistant to magic and has a very decent variation of moves that can deal with both long and close range attacks. But the most damning aspect, I think, which shockingly actually makes the biggest difference, is the immunity to bleed damage. A lot of the runners who had the easiest time with some of these newer bosses were using the katanas, or things like Rivers of Blood which have high bleed. and they would walk through fights like Midra or Metyr, and yet in the Shadow Tree avatar they struggled because they wouldn't have this extra burst of damage. The people who would have the best time would be those with the big bonk weapons. If you look at the variance of deaths across the 5 non-summon runs, you can see that variance goes from 3 deaths to 78 deaths. Then if you look at Midra, who has a very low AF of 2.2, it is down 2 places in the data to 8th. Midra is very weak to bleed, and he proved quite light work for 2 runners with only 2 and 4 deaths respectively for those katana users. The build does make quite the difference. Slapping the sunflower head on the avatar with a strength build proves quite light work for that boss. So every boss just has builds that will deal with them better. Except for Radahn. What about the top 3 then? Well, for Messmer, the overall aggression factor is 2.07, with 2.15 decreasing to 1.98 seconds between attacks when you look at base Serpent Messmer, which already then puts Messmer as the most aggressive of all of the difficult bosses from all games. R'hllana then takes this a step further, with an average of 1.9 seconds between attacks, decreasing from 1.99 AF to 1.72 AF when the twin blades light up, which is easily the most aggressive boss form of all of the bosses, even double Abyss Watchers. And it goes quite a way to explain her status as the 3rd most difficult FromSoft Souls-like boss of all time. Then we finally get to Radahn, an aggression factor of 2.07, which goes from 2.16 down to 1.99 AF when we reach the bottom of Miquella form. You may be saying to yourself, Jazz, this doesn't go with the idea in my head that Twink Lover Radahn is the most devilish, nay, diabolically aggressive boss fight in any FromSoft game. To which I will say, hold your horses. During my collection of the data, I checked the timings of some of these attacks. In Pillow Princess Radahn's 2nd form, he has the Holy AoE Blast, the Miquella Cuddle, and the Meteor Slam V2. These moves last 8 seconds, 11 seconds if successful, and 11 seconds respectively. So, if you were to remove these from the timings, this would push this form down to 1.58 seconds between attacks. By far the most aggressive, and would make the overall fight a 1.85 AF, which is more aggressive than R'hllana, with a far higher damage output and HP pool. And you've got to think here, Radahn is the 2nd most aggressive boss of all time, and yet it still has these 3 long moves in it. This graph here does a decent job of showing how the lower the aggression factor, the higher the resulting deaths seem to be. It's not perfect, of course, but it does make logical sense. If you're getting attacked more often in a short space of time, you're going to have a more difficult time healing or retaliating safely. I had a couple of questions in the comments that did actually help shape where some of my analysis went this time round. JRod___8137 said, 68 deaths to Royal Rat Authority is wild. Yep, it totally is. I actually checked 2 more runs and the average deaths for the big dog would be about 7.75 without Zimmel's 68 deaths in 1 run to it. Del Darrell asks, I wish you showed more details on Dark Souls 2 because I really wonder how Fume Knight and Nameless King compare. So, let's do a quick comparison of some of the key factors. I checked 2 more random runs for the Fume Knight and found 23 and 24 deaths, which if they were chosen runs, which unfortunately they weren't the first time round, Fume Knight would have been comfortably 2nd with about 57 deaths. The aggression factor is 3.77 and the hits per death is 10.9. Also, the run back time is quite short with only 15 seconds, so certainly the Fume Knight is harder than the original data suggested. If you compare this to Nameless King, the deaths are far higher on an average run. 19 per run for the Fume Knight with these new runs compared to 140 per run for the Nameless King. The aggression factor is higher, 5.5 for Nameless King, but if you take the 2nd form, it is much lower than Fume Knight at 2.44, while having 4.7 hits per death, which is much more deadly than Fume Knight. Also, it has a run back of about 7 seconds, so you're there quite quickly. Generally speaking, across the board, the statistics suggest that Nameless King is just a tougher boss. This makes sense though, as the developers do want to top what they have previously made, and so the bosses will be tougher, and I've seen that in every single game so far. Crunchy Tire says, I think as an entire player base we've just gotten better, and having the internet helps a bunch. When I got Demon's Souls on PS3 we had no internet, and trying to figure it out was the hardest game I'd played at the time. I'm inclined to agree wholeheartedly. When you have a niche community with something quite unique, there aren't a whole lot of resources dedicated to helping new players until the community grows. Unfortunately, I don't think this is well represented enough in Demon's Souls for my data collection, as so few normal Let's Plays and runs were on YouTube before Dark Souls 1 came out. And even then, those were people who were clearly using guides. Howdy Friends 7950 says, the only thing that surprises me is Sekiro being lower than Elden Ring, where Sekiro doesn't have any way to get overleveled and wallop a boss by sheer force without learning their patterns. This is absolutely true. So the data I collected specifically came from people stating this was their first ever FromSoft Souls-like. And I even looked and tested this, as if they didn't know how to lock on immediately, I sort of agreed with them. And so, when I actually watched 2 more runs of a second playthrough for someone who'd been new to each game, and then played it again a second time, the Elden Ring deaths decreased immensely, by 95%, whereas the Sekiro deaths decreased by only 71%. Elden Ring has enough tools to lower the skill ceiling, while Sekiro will always maintain a consistent skill floor. Joshua Secco 7115 asks, I'm curious to see the deaths for Elden Ring split into 2 categories, one with deaths using spirit summons, and one without. I am curious about that as well. So, it's a feature that is in every single game except for Sekiro, and in Elden Ring, spirit summons were introduced as well to add another layer of complexity to this data. Or perhaps I should say simplicity. So I've done 10 runs, 5 with and 5 without any summons, to show the difference between the two, and I've also broken every single top 3 most difficult boss from each game into summoned and unsummoned figures to get a difference. Before that, what's the actual difference between summoning and not summoning? Well, in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, every extra summon or NPC adds 50% to the boss's health pool. In Dark Souls 2, every extra summon and NPC adds extra resistances to the boss. 1 is a 33% reduction in damage, 2 is a 50% reduction in damage, and 3 is a 67% reduction in damage. Bloodborne follows the 50% HP per summon as well. I had to test Dark Souls 3 myself, but yes, it is adding 50% HP to the bosses. Sekiro has no summoning, it's easy. Elden Ring's quite interesting. The Spirit Ashes do not actually increase the boss's HP in any way, whereas NPC and player summons do, similarly, the 50% extra HP. Let's look at how the summons actually affected the boss difficulty across the games. I actually, for Demon's Souls, didn't use Dragon God as it's a gimmick and really wouldn't be affected by summoning, and so it wouldn't really give me a good bit of data for this. So I chose Man-Eaters, Old King Alant, and Flame Lurkers. And you'll see that the average deaths shrink by 94.4% if you summon. Dying once with a summoned ally is equivalent to dying 18 times fighting the same boss solo. This trend actually follows for the remaining games, with every game having more than a 90% drop in deaths when you summon an ally in the toughest fights, leading up to Elden Ring with a 93.4% death rate drop. Dark Souls 1 is the only game where the rate is actually under 90%, but just barely, with 88.4%. These came from Biggie Smalls and Artorias, where 3 of these fights with the summoned allies actually led to 0 deaths, so it is still quite considerably powerful. Shadow of the Erdtree also follows this trend nicely, being extremely close to Elden Ring, which was expected. Now let's look at the spirit summons in Elden Ring. On one hand, the addition of spirit summons does not add any extra health onto the boss, so it should make it very easy for you to chip at them and draw aggro away. But you've got to remember, one big drawback is the fact that they're controlled by enemy AI, as opposed to an intelligent fellow jolly cooperator. Quickly, the most popular spirit summons were the Mimic Tear, Loathsome Dung Eater, and Black Knife Tish. And this obviously comes from the well-known Mimic Tear usage of the fact that they can heal themselves and use the weapons and items that you have to double your proccing of certain statuses. Looking at the actual figures in the base Elden Ring game, the drop was only about 76.1%. For context, one death with spirit summons is worth 3.84 solo deaths. Just from player experience, this certainly comes from bosses having moves to deal with multiple unintelligent opponents. For example, Melania, you'll drop kick her in the first phase quite comfortably, and yet in the Goddess of Rot form, the Ionian Bomb will always hit your spirit summon, without failure, and deal quite considerable damage to them. Whereas another Sunbro would know to avoid this. Shadow of the Erdtree is a little bit better, which I suspect comes a lot down to Radahn. Messmer has a 57.8% drop in deaths per run if you use spirit summons, compared to 89.3 DPR for summoned allies. But Radahn is the only boss that I observed to have a lower DPR percentage for summoned allies than spirit summons, meaning that it's actually less advantageous to summon an ally than to just fight Radahn using the Mimic Tear. In Shadow of the Erdtree, some of the bosses have NPCs which assist you in the fight and more for story purposes. But if you do this on Radahn with both Sir Arnsbach and Tollier, this will increase his HP from 46,134 to roughly 92,268 HP. Sir Arnsbach has roughly 41,100 HP, which in 3 separate attacks from Radahn takes off 3,646 HP. Or 9% of his total HP in one combo. On the flip side, Arnsbach does about 932 HP damage in 3 attacks, which is almost exactly 1% of Radahn's HP with 2 summons. This, coupled with Radahn's sweeping attacks that cover a wide area and some extremely damaging attacks that the AI cannot handle, when he raises in the air and does his holy AoE, the NPCs are drawn like a moth to a flame to get hit. So these NPCs have quite literally one advantage in drawing aggro for you, but assuming that both your NPCs will die in about 33 hits, you have to make sure Radahn is down to roughly 20,000 HP for it to even be worth it, which oftentimes isn't. With all of these Souls-likes and their DLCs analysed, it is clear now that Elden Ring is the toughest FromSoft game on the first playthrough of a new player. 4 out of the top 10 most difficult bosses are from Elden Ring, and 3 of the top 5 now are as well. Shadow of the Erdtree itself is responsible for 3 of these hardest bosses of all time. Yes, Radahn's Sex Toy of Miquella is the hardest FromSoft Souls-like boss of all time. 1,136 deaths, the second most aggressive boss of all time, even with 3 slow attacks, and the only boss that is actually less advisable to fight with Sunbros, as opposed to your own Spirit Ashes. But this also sheds light on the bosses slowly getting more and more aggressive over time. Some people complained that Shadow of the Erdtree was too difficult and cannot be considered fun anymore. Which technically it is, but I see this cycle every time a From Software game is released. I loved playing Shadow of the Erdtree. I know I broke it down on a very mathematical level, but goodness me, these games are such a wonder to play through. Every environment is a jaw-dropping backdrop to some of the most engaging and immersive gameplay you could ever want. A complete game that trusts the player to discover and grow without any hand-holding. The whole Abyssal Forest's eerie atmosphere, along with piecing together the story of the Manse and potentially connecting Nanaya to Shabriri, culminating in Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame, is a completely spectacular stretch of gameplay. The worst part about playing one of FromSoft's games is that now I have to wait a few years for the next one. Let's hope we all don't go hollow. Thank you everyone.